Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back. So in the last video, or in the last couple of videos, we started talking about modern JavaScript syntax, basically newer version of JavaScript and more modern way of writing JavaScript code. The functionalities don't change much. What mostly changes is the syntax helps us to write cleaner code and neater syntax. So we've seen how to declare variables using let and const. We saw arrow functions, which basically is a modern way of writing functions. We also saw template literals, which gives us a more concise way of doing string concatenation. We saw destructuring, which basically allows us to unpack the properties of an object or element of an array into distinct variables. We also saw default parameters, which allows us to pass a default value for a function parameter, so that when we call that function, even if we don't pass an argument to it, it will use the default parameter that we had when we created the function. And we also looked at rest and spread operator, which basically allows us to handle objects and array elements, either spreading out the existing properties of an object or elements of an array. And then we saw, actually we're going to look at optional chaining and Nullish Coalescing operator today. So these two basically help us achieve similar goal. So we're going to look at them more closely and see why they are useful and what problems they are solving. Okay, so let's start with optional chaining. Optional chaining. Let's start with there. Now we have a user object, right? And then we have these properties: first name, last name, and age. Now we want to access zip code. This is very common. This is very common because when you are working with JavaScript, especially on the front end, I mean wherever, even on the back end, so sometimes you try to access properties of an object. Maybe you really are not familiar with the structure of the data in that object. So let's say you are dealing with this user, and I mean by default you might think that a user object should have an address field to it. So let's say you want to access the zip code of the address. So you do things like user.address.zipcode, right? And then you want to use the zip code somewhere, and you try to do, let's say you just want to log it out to the console, and then, or maybe let's say you even want to use it and pass it as a value to somewhere down the line in your code. Well, for the sake of simplicity, what we are doing here is we're just trying to log out zip code in the console. When you do that, you're gonna get an error. First of all, you don't get anything in the console. Instead, you get an error that says uncaught type error, cannot read property of undefined, right? So it is trying to read zip code. So basically what it's saying is you are trying to read a zip code property of an object that doesn't exist, right? That's what it's saying, and that is true because user does exist, but there is no address object. There is no address property, which this line assumes that there is an address property, and that address property is an object that has a zip code property. But the problem is address doesn't exist in this user property, so it shows that type error. And this is a very common error you will see. You mostly see in JavaScript code, and it happens just because of this scenario. Okay, so what do you do? So what you can do is you use optional chaining. So basically you're gonna say only try to assess this if it's available. If it's not available, let's see what happens. So you see the error is gone, right? It doesn't throw an error, and what you get is it just returns undefined. Okay, so basically it's saying this is not available, zip code is not available, user is not available, address is not available. So rather than throwing an error, it gracefully just returns undefined. And I think this is good. Now, how you would have handled this is by using if statement. So you could do things like if user, if there is a user and there is user dot address, okay, and there is user dot address dot zip code. So if all of these properties exist, you'd now do console.log this. Actually, let's put this out. You now console.log user.address.zip code. Put this here, then else. So you log not available, just something like this. So so you now check your console. Now you're gonna get, actually let's save this, you're gonna get not available, right? So this works, but it's a lot of code, right? It's a lot of code. Or let's try to mimic exactly what this line of code is doing. So this is basically what it's doing. So you see 1 2 3 4, like how many lines of code basically doing the same thing. So this is the only way for you to not get an error if you are not using the optional chaining. So it makes a lot of sense that we are able to replace all of this with just this line. Okay, I think it's really cool. And yeah, we get undefined. So that's how you do optional chaining. When you're not sure if the property is there, just use this operator and then access a property that you are not sure whether it exists. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about the nullish coalescing. It does similar thing. So basically it's a way of providing a default value for when a value you are trying to access is null or undefined. Now this guy just helps us to return undefined without throwing an error, but nullish coalescing helps us to put a fallback value. So let's say for instance let's say const first name, or you know what, okay, we could do this. We could say console.log so we already know that zip code likely does not exist, so we can say console.log zip code. Now if it's not there, which we are going to get, it's not there, we're going to get undefined. Let's take this away. So we could use this guy here to pass a default value. So since we are looking for zip code, you could have like 1 2 3 4, and that's the zip code. So when we check, we get 1 2 3 4. So basically it's saying, so we use optional chaining to try to assess the property, and then we use nullish coalescing operator to define or to specify a default value that it should fall back to in case that property doesn't exist. I hope that makes sense. So you can see this two syntax gives us a very clean way to not only safely assess deeply nested properties of an object, but also to put a condition, put a fallback value for when that property is not there. I hope that makes sense. So leave me a comment, or leave me leave a comment to just share your thoughts. If something is not clear, just drop it as a question in a comment and I'll attend to it. Now I want us to look at promises. I think that's one last important thing we need to look at before we conclude on this. Now Yeah, so let's talk about promises. I think we can talk about promises in the next video, so let me just stop this here so that in the next video we'll continue to talk about promises. See you guys.